Picture this. It's March 31st, 1913. A man lies dying in a suite at the Grand Hotel in Rome. He's 75 years old. His name is J.P. Morgan, and he controls more wealth than most sovereign nations. When news of his death reaches Wall Street the next morning, something remarkable happens. The stock market doesn't crash. It steadies. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful private banker in American history dies, and markets become more stable, not less. That tells you everything you need to know about what killed the Gilded Age. This is the story of how America's Age of Titans came to an end, not with a bang, but with the quiet creation of institutions that made individual power obsolete. For 40 years, men like J.P. Morgan had operated as private gods of finance. They reorganized industries, saved banks, even rescued the U.S. Treasury when the government itself ran out of money. They believed their concentrated power was not just necessary, but good, efficient, the natural order of things. They were wrong. Between 1890 and 1913, three forces converged to dismantle the Gilded Age: labor unrest that couldn't be suppressed, political reforms that couldn't be stopped, and institutional power that replaced individual control. J.P. Morgan's story touches all three. His life built the old system. His death revealed it was already gone. If you enjoy long-form documentaries about the forces that shaped America, hit subscribe. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think we're living through the end of a new Gilded Age right now? This is the story of the man who saved capitalism, and the moment America decided one man should never have that power again. To understand why Morgan's death didn't crash markets, you first need to understand the empire he built. John Pierpont Morgan was born in 1837 into banking wealth. But what he created went far beyond inheritance. His father, Junius Morgan, ran a successful international banking house in London. Young Pierpont learned the business early, but he didn't just inherit his empire. He built it by recognizing something other bankers missed. Chaos is expensive, and the man who can organize chaos can name his price. In the 1880s and 1890s, American railroads were a disaster. Dozens of competing lines, built too fast with borrowed money, were going bankrupt in spectacular fashion. Morgan saw opportunity. He began buying failing railroads, reorganizing them, eliminating competition, and refinancing their debt. His critics called it monopoly. Morgan called it Morganization, turning disorder into profitable order. By 1900, he controlled more rail track than any other man in America. But railroads were just the beginning. In 1901, J.P. Morgan pulled off the biggest business deal in history up to that point. He bought Andrew Carnegie's steel empire for $480 million, roughly $16 billion in today's dollars. Then he merged it with several other companies to create United States Steel Corporation, the first billion-dollar company in American history. Let that sink in for a moment. One corporation worth more than $1 billion, at a time when the entire federal budget was under $500 million per year. Morgan now controlled steel production, railroads to ship it, and the banks that financed both. He sat on the boards of dozens of corporations. His banking house, J.P. Morgan and Company, underwrote government bonds, financed international trade, and could make or break businesses with a single decision. His power manifested physically in a building at the corner of Madison Avenue and 36th Street in Manhattan. The Morgan Library was ostensibly a private library to house his collection of rare books and manuscripts. In reality, it was a fortress. Its walls were built with multiple layers of brick, stone, and steel. No windows on the first floor. A massive bronze door that weighed tons. This wasn't just about protecting books. This was about projecting control. Inside, Morgan's study was fitted with Renaissance art, Italian ceiling panels, and a desk positioned to ensure Morgan always faced the door, always maintained the superior position. Visitors described feeling like they were entering the chamber of a Renaissance prince, not a modern banker. Here, in this room, Morgan would soon make decisions that would save the American economy. And those decisions would ultimately seal his fate. By 1905, Morgan's reach was staggering. He controlled more than 40% of American railroad mileage, U.S. Steel producing 70% of the nation's steel, International Harvester dominating farm equipment, General Electric at the forefront of electrification, multiple major banks and insurance companies, later the Pujo Committee, a congressional investigation we'll come to shortly, would estimate that Morgan and his close associates directly controlled $22 billion in assets. That's roughly 1/4 of all wealth in the United States. Not 1/4 of financial wealth, 1/4 of everything. No private citizen has held that percentage of national wealth since. People called him Jupiter, the king of the gods. To walk into a room where Morgan sat was to feel the weight of concentrated power. Presidents consulted him. Senators feared him. Foreign governments negotiated with him as if he were a head of state. And for a while, that system worked. Or at least, it worked for men like Morgan. But three forces were building that even Jupiter couldn't control. The first force was labor unrest, and it wasn't going away. The wealth that men like Morgan accumulated didn't materialize from thin air. It was built by workers, millions of them, who labored in dangerous conditions for wages that barely sustained life. And as the Gilded Age progressed, those workers began to organize. In 1892, the Homestead Strike erupted at a Carnegie steel mill outside Pittsburgh. Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie's partner and Morgan's ally, decided to break the union. He brought in 300 Pinkerton detectives, essentially a private army, by barge up the Monongahela River at dawn. The workers were waiting. A 12-hour battle ensued. 10 men died, 7 workers, 3 Pinkertons. The river, witnesses said, ran red. Federal troops eventually crushed the strike. The Union was destroyed. But something had changed. The violence shocked the nation. The image of corporate titans deploying private armies against American workers was harder to justify with each passing year. 2 years later, in 1894, the Pullman strike paralyzed railroads across the country. Again, federal troops intervened, this time on direct orders from President Grover Cleveland. The strike was broken, but at enormous cost to public perception of who the government truly served. Then came 1902. The anthracite coal strike threatened to leave American cities without heat as winter approached. This time, President Theodore Roosevelt did something unprecedented. He didn't automatically side with capital. He forced mine owners to negotiate with workers. It was the first time a sitting president had intervened against business interests in a labor dispute. Morgan watched these events with growing concern. To him, strikes were inefficiencies to be eliminated. Labor was a cost to be managed, like any other. The idea that workers might have legitimate grievances, that inequality might breed instability, this didn't compute in Morgan's worldview. He believed concentrated power in the hands of capable men created order. The alternative, he thought, was chaos. The second force was building more quietly in the realm of politics. But it would explode into public view in 1907. In October of that year, a financial panic struck. It began with the collapse of a speculation scheme, but it spread rapidly. Banks failed, depositors panicked, credit froze. The US economy stood at the edge of collapse, and the federal government had no mechanism to stop it. No Federal Reserve, no deposit insurance, no lender of last resort. Except J.P. Morgan. On the night of November 2nd, 1907, Morgan gathered the most powerful bankers in America in his library. That same library, the fortress on Madison Avenue. He locked the doors, literally. The bronze door was closed, and Morgan held the key in his pocket. For hours, he moved between rooms, negotiating, cajoling, threatening. In his study, he smoked cigars and played solitaire, while bankers presented him with their institution's balance sheets. He decided who would be saved and who would be allowed to fail. He forced healthy banks to pool resources to bail out failing ones. He personally pledged his own fortune to stabilize key institutions. By morning, the panic was contained. Morgan had saved American capitalism. Newspapers hailed him as a hero. The stock market recovered. President Roosevelt thanked him personally. But here's what Morgan didn't see coming. His rescue terrified America more than the panic itself. Think about what that night revealed. The American economy, the entire financial system of a nation of 90 million people, had been saved by one private citizen making unilateral decisions in a locked room. Not by elected officials, not by government institutions, not by democratic processes. By one man's personal judgment and personal wealth. If Morgan had failed or refused to act, the consequences would have been catastrophic. And that meant America's economic survival depended on the character, capability, and goodwill of a single private individual. That realization crystallized something that had been building for years. Concentrated private power wasn't efficient, it was dangerous. The progressive movement, which had been gaining momentum since the late 1890s, now had its clearest argument yet. Reform wasn't just about fairness or morality, it was about survival. No modern nation could allow one man to wield that much power, no matter how responsibly he claimed to use it. Morgan had saved capitalism. In doing so, he'd convinced America that men like him were the problem. The political backlash came swiftly, and it came from the top. Theodore Roosevelt, who became president after McKinley's assassination in 1901, was no radical. He came from the same elite social circles as Morgan. But Roosevelt believed something Morgan didn't, that unchecked corporate power would ultimately destroy capitalism by making it intolerable to the majority of Americans. In 1902, Roosevelt's Justice Department filed suit against Northern Securities Company, a railroad holding company that Morgan had created. The suit claimed it violated the Sherman Antitrust Act by monopolizing rail traffic in the Northwest. Morgan was stunned. The Sherman Act had been on the books since 1890, but it had rarely been enforced against major corporations. Morgan believed problems like this were supposed to be worked out privately, between gentlemen. He went directly to the White House. The meeting has become legendary. Morgan reportedly told Roosevelt, If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up. Roosevelt's response was the sound of an era ending. That can't be done. Morgan couldn't grasp what Roosevelt meant. We and my man. This was how Morgan saw the world. A club of powerful men who settled disputes through negotiation, not legal proceedings. The idea that the President of the United States might not be part of that club, might in fact see that club as the problem, this was incomprehensible. The Supreme Court ruled against Northern Securities in 1904. Morgan's Railroad Trust was broken up. More antitrust actions followed against Standard Oil, American Tobacco, and other giant trusts. The message was clear. The age of unrestricted consolidation was over. But the decisive blow came in 1912, 5 years after the Panic of 1907. Congress created the Pujo Committee, formerly the House Committee on Banking and Currency, to investigate what they called the money trust. The question driving the investigation was simple. Had financial power become so concentrated that a small group of men effectively controlled the American economy? The answer, methodically documented over months of hearings, was yes. The committee called dozens of witnesses. They examined thousands of documents. They mapped out interlocking directorates, the same men sitting on boards of dozens of corporations. They traced the flow of capital through a handful of banking houses. They revealed just how small the circle of power really was. And in December 1912, they called J.P. Morgan himself to testify. Morgan was 75 years old. His health was failing. He would be dead within 4 months. But he came to Washington to defend the system he embodied. The questioning was relentless. How much control did his firm exercise? Which corporations did he influence? How did he decide who got capital and who didn't? Morgan's answers revealed everything about his worldview. When asked about the basis of commercial credit, he gave an answer that has echoed through history. Examiner: is not commercial credit based primarily upon money or property? Morgan: no, sir. The first thing is character. Examiner: before money or property? Morgan: before money or anything else. Money cannot buy it. On the surface, this sounds noble. Character matters. Trust matters. These are true statements. But think about what Morgan was really saying. He was arguing that financial power should flow to men of proven character, which in practice meant men who shared his background, his social circles, his values. Men like him. The system he defended wasn't based on democratic accountability or institutional rules. It was based on the personal judgment of a small elite deciding who deserved access to capital and who didn't. Morgan genuinely believed this was the right way to organize an economy. He saw himself as a responsible steward. He had rescued the economy multiple times. He had funded museums, collected art, preserved rare books. In his mind, concentrated power in capable hands had built modern America. What he couldn't see, what he would never see, was that his system was already obsolete. While Morgan testified, the wave of progressive legislation was cresting. In 1913 alone, the year Morgan died, 2 constitutional amendments were ratified that fundamentally altered American governance. The 16th Amendment established a federal income tax. For the first time, the federal government could directly tax the wealth of the richest Americans. No longer would government revenue depend primarily on tariffs that fell hardest on consumers. The 17th Amendment mandated direct election of senators. Previously, state legislatures chose senators, making them easier for wealthy interests to influence. Now, senators would answer directly to voters. And in December 1913, 9 months after Morgan's death, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, creating a central banking system to perform the stabilizing role Morgan had played in 1907. The institutional infrastructure to replace men like Morgan was being built while he still lived. His testimony was the defense of a system that had already lost. On March 31, 1913, J.P. Morgan died in his sleep at the Grand Hotel in Rome. He had gone to Egypt and Europe for his health, but age and stress had caught up to him. His body was returned to New York aboard his own yacht, the Corsair. The funeral was held at St. George's Church on Stuyvesant Square. Thousands lined the streets. Presidents, senators, and business leaders filled the pews. It was a spectacle befitting the king of American finance. But here's what didn't happen. Markets didn't panic. On April 1st, the day news of Morgan's death reached Wall Street, stocks opened lower but quickly stabilized. Trading was orderly. No banks failed. No mass selling. The Dow Jones Industrial Average ended the day down slightly, well within normal fluctuation. Why? Because by March 1913, the system no longer depended on J.P. Morgan. The Federal Reserve Bill was already working its way through Congress. Everyone knew institutional backstops were coming. The era of one man holding emergency power was ending. More importantly, Morgan's firm, J.P. Morgan and Company, would continue operating. The institution survived even though the titan had fallen. That's the key insight. Individual power had been replaced by institutional power. Morgan spent his life believing that concentrated authority in the hands of capable individuals was the most efficient way to organize an economy. That personal character and judgment should determine the flow of capital. That men like him were not just capable of wielding enormous power, but obligated to. America decided differently. Not through revolution, but through institution building. In the years after Morgan's death, his empire was systematically constrained. The firm continued, but regulated. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 would eventually force the separation of commercial and investment banking, breaking up the kind of combined power Morgan wielded. His art collection, one of the greatest private collections ever assembled, was dispersed. Most of it went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it remains today. The public, not a private individual, became the steward of those treasures. His mansion at 219 Madison Avenue, that monument to Gilded Age excess, was demolished in 1928. The land was too valuable to waste on a single family's residence. In its place rose an office building. The private gave way to the commercial. Only the Morgan Library survived, and even it became public. Today, it's the Morgan Library and Museum, open to anyone who buys a ticket. You can stand in Morgan's study, the room where he locked bankers in during the 1907 panic. But you're standing there as part of a democratic public, not as a supplicant to power. Morgan's story illustrates how the Gilded Age actually ended, and it wasn't through the death of its titans. The first force was labor organization. Despite bloody suppression, despite broken strikes, despite everything men like Morgan could do to stop it, workers continued organizing. Unions survived. Labor laws gradually improved working conditions. The 8-hour day, workplace safety regulations, child labor restrictions, these victories came from organized resistance, not philanthropic generosity. The second force was political reform. The progressive era created new tools for democratic control: direct election of senators, women's suffrage, antitrust enforcement, income tax, regulatory agencies. Bit by bit, elected government gained power to check private wealth. The third force was institutional replacement. This is the key. The Federal Reserve replaced Morgan's emergency interventions. Antitrust law replaced personal negotiation. Public museums replaced private collections. Regulatory agencies replaced gentlemen's agreements. These three forces weren't separate. They were connected responses to the same problem. Concentrated private power had become incompatible with democracy and economic stability. Here's the central irony. Morgan saved capitalism in 1907, and in doing so, convinced America to create the institutional framework that would make men like him obsolete. His rescue demonstrated both his capability and the danger of depending on that capability. It proved that private power could stabilize crisis, and simultaneously proved that no modern nation could afford to rely on private power for stability. Morgan believed he was defending a system of responsible elite governance. He thought his critics were dangerous radicals who didn't understand how wealth and power actually worked. But his critics weren't trying to destroy capitalism. They were trying to save it from men like Morgan. Not because Morgan was evil, but because any system that depended on the character of a single individual was inherently fragile. The Gilded Age didn't end because its titans lost their wealth or their nerve. It ended because America built institutions powerful enough to operate without them. Walk down Madison Avenue to 36th Street today. The Morgan Library still stands, though surrounded by modern additions. You can buy a ticket for $22. Inside, you can see the study where Morgan made his greatest decisions. The Renaissance ceiling is still there, the red damask walls, the massive desk. But you're not there as a petitioner. You're there as a member of the public who owns this history now. Morgan's mansion is gone. Most of the great Gilded Age mansions are gone. But the Federal Reserve Building in Washington still stands. The regulatory agencies created during the Progressive Era still function. The institutions outlasted the individuals. That's not poetic justice. That's just how history works. Before I leave you with one final thought, do you think we're living through the end of a new Gilded Age right now? Drop a comment. I read every one, and I'm genuinely curious what you think. Because here's what makes this story relevant. Every era believes its power structure is permanent. The titans of the Gilded Age thought their system would last forever. They had the money, they had the influence, they believed, the character and capability to manage a complex modern economy better than any democratic system could. They were wrong, but not because they were stupid or evil. They were wrong because concentrated power, no matter how responsibly wielded by individuals, cannot provide the stability and legitimacy that modern economies require. We're asking the same questions today about tech billionaires, about financial concentration, about whether systems need democratic accountability or if capable individuals should be trusted to self-regulate. The Gilded Age gives us an answer if we're willing to see it. J.P. Morgan died believing he had saved American capitalism. He had, just not in the way he intended. His rescues convinced America that saving capitalism meant limiting the power of men like him. The institutions created in response to his dominance outlasted his mansions, survived his death, and still shape our economy today. The Gilded Age didn't end with a market crash or a revolution. It ended with the quiet construction of systems more powerful than any individual. Perhaps that's the most important thing titans never understand. Empires built by one person always fall. But institutions, carefully built and properly maintained, can outlast generations. Thank you for watching.